Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of the Brokecast. Just want to first give everyone a heads up and a thank you to everyone who listened to my episode 0, which was more of an audio test and something that I was kind of using to gauge what kind of style I wanted to interact with, what kind of podcasting abilities I had, and kind of what anyone's overall thoughts were. So hopefully from here on we're going to have some more specific episodes, and we're going to have a lot better, higher quality content. But again, just want to thank everyone that kind of listened to my first episode 0. It was just some close friends of mine, but thanks for muscling through. They're going to get better from here, and I promise we're going to have a fun time. So first episode took me a minute to think about what I wanted to actually do. And after thinking for a while, I thought there wouldn't be a more appropriate subject to use than to talk about ego, right? Starting a podcast, why would one want to start a podcast? Are they so self-absorbed that perhaps they just want to hear themselves talk? Who knows? I'm sure a little bit of that goes into it, but I don't think that's the main point of it. But in any event, ego, right? So let's begin. So what is ego? Well, the dictionary defines ego as a person's sense of self-esteem, I want to be specific, so I'm reading off this one, or self-importance. And what self-esteem is defined as is essentially confidence in one's own worth or abilities, right? So ego is this idea of how well you can do something and how much confidence you have in yourself to actually get that accomplished, right? And again, a component of that is ingrained within our society today, which is one's own self-importance of, well, am I the best person to do this? Maybe there's no one better who can do this, right? That's all pieces of ego. All of that goes in together. So that's the dictionary definition, right? But I think it's also important to take that a step further and understand where that potentially came from. And that originated in Freudian psychology, right? And so in order to define the ego in that context, you have to understand the idea of what Freudian psychology was, right? And in Freudian psychology, you had an ego, a superego, and an id, right? So your ego was really your conscious thought. So what we're discussing right now, okay? So it's what you know at a top level. Do I know that my shirt is gray? Yes, I do. Do I know that my beard is black? Yes, I do. Do I know that I want a sip of coffee? Yes, I do. A step below that is your superego, right? And that kind of lived in your pre-conscious, okay? And your superego is something that kind of grows over time and has really been cultivated by your parents, okay? So your superego is this part of you that governs morality, that says, okay, you shouldn't do this. You should do this. This is the best way to do something. It's moral. It's just. It's striving for perfection. It wants you to be the best you can within the constraints of society. And that's why you learn pieces of it from your parents, because essentially your parents are the ones who teach you what morality is, or they should. Some of us had to learn on our own, but still, that's kind of what it's all about, right? And it wants to become part of the conscience, and that's why a lot of times they'll describe it, and this is an oversimplification of it, as kind of like an angel on your shoulder sitting there saying, hey, this is the best way to do good, this is what you should do, this is the right thing. The final level below that in Freudian psychology is the id, as I discussed a second ago, and that's really your unconscious thought. Your unconscious thoughts. And so basically what your id is your basic impulses. We're talking about sex, aggression, food, hunger. Sorry, little kitties running around. Have the window open, and I'm really enjoying the first day of fall, in my opinion. May not be, but you know what? The air feels like it. Nice, crisp, and cool. But I digress. The id, right, is your basic impulses. Sex, hunger, food. What are your wants? What are your desires? What are your needs? It seeks gratification. And the reason for this is it lives in this area of unconscious thought, right? So thoughts that you can not access, things that are in the back of your mind, right? Like you don't know what is really at those lowest levels. That's really what your id is, right? Again, your superego is pre-conscious thought, which essentially is between that lowest level of unconscious thought of not knowing, between your conscious thought of what you do know, and it kind of lives in between. And it's one of those things that you could know it if you wanted to. Again, morals for superego. Id is kind of pleasure seeking, if you will. And before we get into id, and again, I'll kind of leave the id thing for another discussion later, but pleasure seeking is not inherently a bad thing in a sense that it wants your deepest desires, and those could inherently be good. They could actually be more moral in a sense of what society sees as moral than the actual morals you were taught, right? But again, let's save that topic for another day. So back to ego, right? So ego, conscious thought, its job is also to mediate between the id and the superego. So it kind of decides, right, whether you're going to go with more of a primal instinct of your id, or if you're going to choose an option that might be more moral, like your superego, okay? And one of the interesting parts about the ego is it's always testing reality, okay? And essentially what is meant by that is it is verifying what is currently going on in your surroundings and how you yourself are adapting to them. And that kind of relates back to the original definition of a person's sense of self-esteem, right? And or self-importance, okay? Because it's like, at the end of the day, if you didn't have your ego, then you essentially would not be able to relate to where you are within society, within the context of what you're doing, and within what you're actually trying to accomplish, okay? Now, kind of complex, but that's a bastardized version of Freudian psychology. Before we get into my definition of it and how it kind of applies and the way I see it applying, right, I want to talk about one more thing very briefly, which is the Jungian psychology. And for just a very, very brief overview of Jungian psychology. So Freud kind of came before Jung, and then Jung took what Freud had and built upon it and said, okay, basically what Freud has is a very basic understanding of one's own mind. Let's build upon that and let's take that step further. So he was really focused on all these archetypes of who you are as a person, and what he considered masks or ideas of the self, in my own, again, bastardized version of it, that you may not be fully aware of, right? And it was really related to the personal unconscious. There was many different archetypes. I don't remember them all, but some of the ones off the top of my head were, the animus, the persona, and the shadow. And that's just essentially the animus, or anima, if you will, is the female and male parts of one's persona, right? Or one's identity. The persona, which essentially is kind of like a mask that you wear on yourself. So basically, it could be something like a false sense of reality, right? Like a great example, I could say I'm the best sprinter in the world, right? I suck at sprinting. I really do. With that being said, I could be wearing the persona of the best sprinter and be saying I'm just as great as Usain Bolt. That's not true, but nonetheless, that would be your persona. Shadow, again, is actually pretty easy to define in Jungian psychology, because that's essentially what Freud has basically designated the id. It's pretty similar to what Jungian's idea of it, essentially, your basic impulses, right? And so the reason this is important is because in Jungian psychology, if someone has a fully developed ego, right, in Jungian psychology, then the ego, which is one's governing mechanism within themselves. Again, this is a bastardized version, so if I'm wrong, please correct me, and I'll make myself a little bit smarter for that. Hopefully I can help you guys out a little bit too, at least to introduce you to these topics. They're very interesting. But the ego kind of is your driving force, right? And if you have a well-developed ego, you can identify with these aspects of your personality, like the shadow, like the anima or the animus, like the persona, and you can pull them out. And the reason that's important, which will lead into the next thing I'm talking about, is because if you know yourself, then you can know what you want. And if you know what you want, then you can focus on how to get it, right? And a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people refuse to accept pieces of their shadow, for example, which, again, we'll save that for another discussion. That's a fun topic. But pieces of your shadow are essentially these basic wants and needs and desires that some people even repress or block out. You see this a lot of times in various religious organizations where they chastise sex and things like that. And you also see this in areas of, self-proclaimed high morality, where questioning certain beliefs or certain ideas will essentially make you morally unjust within the group. It's quite interesting. So anyways, a fully developed ego, right, knows how to say, okay, this is what I want, and now I'm going to take the actions to get there. Perhaps not the actions, but at least enough to know what you want. And again, that's why it's important. And of course, it can also basically say, I know I want this, but I know morally it's not right. And so therefore I'm not going to give in to this impulse, but I'm going to accept that it's a want and a need within myself. And accepting that helps you grow as a person, because it makes you more whole, because you're accepting a part of yourself that is there, that you're essentially unconsciously repressing, and or sometimes consciously repressing, and trying to push back and refusing to say, okay, this part of me that wants something that may not be moral, may not be just, may not be right, it's still part of me, and I am actively choosing to turn that down. That's where strength and power comes from, in my personal opinion. Self-knowledge and self-growth. Now, 1 second, one more sip of coffee, because it's really fucking good today. This coffee is actually from Lake Anne. There's a little coffee shop there and wine bar, and it's absolutely phenomenal. It's kind of my Saturday morning routine. Hit up the farmer's market, grab a cup of coffee. Got a buddy over there named Caleb. He always hooks me up with some of the finest coffee beans they have, but complete side note. Now, what is my definition? How does this kind of apply to me, right? So my definition of ego is essentially similar enough, right? And I thought about this for a while, but it's what governs you, okay? Now, again, to tie this back to originally what I said, why would I start a podcast? Why would I, or I guess a YouTube channel for that matter? Surprise to me. Changed my mind, decided it's going to be a YouTube channel and a podcast as well. But, why is it important that, to me, the ego is what governs you? Because I had to fight off several different things, right, within my ego. I had my ego essentially telling me and accepting parts of my unconscious thoughts, if you will, that, hey, you're not good enough for this. You're not the person. There's better people out there. And I had to fight that off and kind of realize, okay, well, you know what? I may not be the best person at this. I may not be good at this, but by, recognizing what I actually want, which is to do this for myself, and it's not actually to do it to kind of to kind of make money off of it or do anything else. It's really a private thing that I want to share with everyone, because I have some things to get out there, and I think it's going to help me grow, right? So helping to kind of take those thoughts in and combine the two, it really did help me get started in this podcast and just throw out that episode 0, which is private because it's garbage, but nonetheless, it helped me get it out there, and that's the cool part. By knowing myself and knowing that what I wanted and what I thought about myself, I was able to say, okay, I may not be the best, but I'm going to improve on it. And everyone has like a starting point, and they're going to just grow from there, okay? Some cool things about ego to continue on, are the phrase big ego, egotistical, and these are, negative traits that essentially relates to people being self-absorbed or absorbed in oneself, and these can be incredibly detrimental. This is something that I personally have had to fight over years of my entire life. Now, I actually was someone, and I of course I still am, like, don't get me wrong, that had an over-exaggerated sense of one's self-worth, and it's something I still fight to this day, and I think it's very important that everyone should. But it was something when I was younger, it was a bigger problem, right? And just a side note, so here's an interesting story, fact, a little bit of history on me, right? I had kind of a rough childhood, right? I won't get into everything, but let's take school, for example. I basically failed out of every class that I ever had, up through 12th grade. To be quite honest with you, I have no idea how I passed high school. Crushed college because it was fun and interesting. But, in high school, I refused to do the homework, and I aced most of every test. I just didn't want to do the homework, didn't see a need to it if I was, passing the tests without having to study, right? So that essentially got me failing grades, which is quite interesting. But, I had all these, like, teachers and stuff essentially telling me from elementary school all the way until 12th grade that I was absolute garbage. A lot of teachers, even when I was younger in elementary school, I can remember they would literally get the class to chant, sit down and shut up against me, and they would, like, put me outside, and that was, like, really soul crushing and, like, ego, I guess, like, destroying to some degree, right? And I had to kind of overcome and grow past that. And today's time that shit wouldn't fly, but back in the day, it was something that teachers did. They really belittled kids. It was really, really rough. Like, I ask a question, the teacher would get so mad that they would, like, bang their hand on a projector. Those were cool devices. They don't have those anymore. That it would break. I mean, that's actually a true story too. Second grade. I won't name the person, but it was rough for me growing up, because I guess I didn't really always fit in with all the other kids. It was kind of like everyone had their ideas of what they wanted to do, and they had, this collective understanding of what was cool and what was interesting, and I was just kind of, like, doing my own thing on the side, like, thinking about, like, crazy stuff, like what I want to do as a career, in elementary school. And you've got kids that are like, I just want to fucking play with blocks, and I'm like, blocks are cool, but Legos are better. I digress. In any event, so I've always had to deal with this part of me that essentially helped me survive, to a sense, right? Like, after kind of getting, like, shut down by my teachers and just, like, really verbally abused and mentally kind of, like, tortured for a very interesting way of putting it. I had to grow this like tough skin on the outside of myself, which has kind of definitely made me cold to a certain degree, but it also allowed me to kind of survive and get through that into what's important, right? And that right there is something that negatively impacted me as time got on and grew, because I developed this, like, idea that, okay, I can get through anything, and that carried on, and it still does to this day. But I'm much better at fighting it and saying, hey, chill out, you're not the best in the world. But having that internal drive to say, okay, basically you've been told that you're shit, ignore them, you're not shit, you're absolutely crushing it. That was important to kind of survive, right? And fighting that off, that internal idea, is still very hard to this day. So that's why I thought ego was an interesting piece to kind of look at, because it allows me, I guess I used it in a way that was more positive than negative, right? And it's to talk about some of those negatives, being someone who actually had kind of like a overinflated idea of oneself, right? That makes one very overconfident. It can prevent you from accepting different criticisms, but it can also criticize you to a certain degree, in a sense that if you are consumed by your ego, that you believe right, that you're always right, and you're confident in what you can do, then if you get critical comments or things that are negative about you, you might actually take those to heart, right? And you might say, okay, you know what, those comments are all right because I know they're right. And that could be incredibly detrimental to one's idea of themselves. It could lead to depression. It could lead to a lot of negative things. And it's kind of sad when you see people like that. Again, I've never had to deal with that piece of it. I have a very critical sense of my own idea, and I treat myself very harshly, internally, and that's something I'm working on. But you do see a lot of people where they get criticized and they take that to heart so much that it basically destroys who they are, right? And it's rough. It's rough to see that. Conversely, you also see people that are so overconfident that they can't take criticism, right? And that's incredibly problematic. Little sip of coffee. And, if you're someone who can't take criticism, then you can't grow, because you have to separate your idea of who you are and your idea of the way the world sees you, and kind of find that middle ground between the two. And if you have this overinflated sense of yourself, it's very tough to do that, okay? Few positive aspects of having a perhaps an overinflated ego is it can help get the job done, right? In times of crisis, a lot of times you see these folks with these overinflated egos, and they're like, this is the right way to go about it. We're doing this, yada, yada, full swing ahead. And it's like, well, did you even check to see if that was the right direction? Maybe that's not the right approach. And it's like, no, I just know we're going to get it done. That can be, effective in some cases, but a lot of times it can lead to failure, and it can get other people hurt too. So it's always good to kind of, put your own ego in check. And that's an important thing to kind of take into consideration, right? So I guess to kind of tie this all together, the main takeaways are two, really, right? The more you understand about your own ego, why you believe you're so confident in your abilities, why you have this inflated sense of self-importance, will help you learn more about yourself, right? And if you know yourself, you can know what you want, and then you can go get it, and that is so important, okay? And you can also understand that if you know yourself, you can help better understand why society may criticize you in certain ways, or why society may glorify you in certain ways. And finding the reality between those two is so important to being successful in today's society, okay? And then the second piece, right, is really, training yourself to understand that your ego may be your overall governing piece of yourself, but it's okay to kind of turn that down sometimes, right? And to say, hey, let's take a step back. Maybe I'm not always right, because the idea is for self-growth, and no one's always right about everything, but a lot of people out there find criticism hard, and if you can turn down your ego, tone it down, just a little bit, you can help absorb more information that you're missing. And that's so important as well, because if you're not getting all the information coming in, then you're only seeing half the world, and that's kind of a limited way of looking at things, right? So this is going to be the first episode. I'm really excited to get it out. If you like the content, please subscribe. I promise I'm going to be doing bigger things. I've got a few really cool interviews with some people coming up. I'm not really sure what the format's going to look like, since it's really the first episode, but I'm liking this, right? I think what we're going to do is we're going to have basically, one topic. Like today's was ego. I have an idea that I want to do one on friendship. They're not always going to be psychology related. They might be related to something going on in the world today, something like that. My own feelings. If anyone has any specifics they'd like me to chat about, I'm always interested in exploring that. And again, potentially interviewing a few people and having them come on and chat with them in person. Really, really cool people. I promise you on that. It's going to be fun. We'll see how this goes and how I grow. And I'm interested to see my own growth and where that ends up taking me. And I'll see where this channel goes, right? So again, episode 1, ego. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. If you're interested in some more content going forward, please like, subscribe, share, whatever it takes. And together we'll grow this broadcast, or whatever the heck I'm calling it. And I'll see you guys later. Bye.